morning, everyone. My name is Rachel DeGrand, and I help coordinate the webinars for Hausman Johnson Insurance. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Tales from the Trenches, the latest cyber attacks and how to avoid them, presented by David Cruz of Hausman Johnson Insurance, who will be joined by Nathan Little and Christopher Gerg of Gillware. If you have a question during the webinar, please feel free to type it into the questions feature, and David, Nathan, and Christopher will address it. After the webinar is over, there will be a short survey we are hoping you can fill out for us to give us feedback on the webinar and webinar topics you are interested in learning more about. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on the webinar archive section of our website. Each attendee will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording and the presentation slides. Each attendee will also receive a ransomware prevention and response guide. These guides are available now in the handout feature of this webinar and will also be included in the follow-up email. I would now like to introduce you to our moderator for today's webinar, David Cruz. Welcome, David.
Yep. Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you, Nathan, thank you, Chris, for being here today. So the impetus behind having this particular session today really stems from the conversations that really we're all having with our clients when we're out there talking about issues like this. So in my particular role here, I spend a good amount of my time working with business owners of all stripes and really all industry verticals. And across the board, the risk of a cyber attack and the impact on your business is on top of everyone's mind right now. So as you look at the scope of risks that could be presented, we want to focus on, okay, what are the ones that could have the most immediate and the most devastating impact, and what steps can we take to help avoid them? So that's really what prompted this discussion here today. So there we go. So that's me on the left there, a technology risk consultant and cyber practice leader with Hausman Johnson Insurance here in Madison. And with us today, we've got Christopher Gerg, the CISO and Vice President of Risk Management. Chris Gerg is the VP of Risk Management at Gillware. He is the technical lead with over 15 years of information security experience. He has worked in mature information security teams and has built information security programs from scratch and leading them into maturity in a wide variety of compliance regimes. While an expert in the theoretical aspects of information security best practice, he is also experienced in the practical aspects of building secure technical environments and working with the boardroom to promote executive understanding and support. He also authored the O'Reilly & Associates book, Managing Network Security Risk with Snort and IDS Tools. Chris, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
We've also got Nathan Little, Vice President of Incident Response and Forensics at Gillware. He leads the incident response and data breach investigation team in tackling instances of ransomware, business email compromise, wire transfer fraud, insider threats, and other forms of network compromise. Nathan and his team specialize in stopping ongoing incidents, finding root cause, determining the extent of the attack, all while swiftly restoring businesses to full operation in order to minimize business outage expenses. Nathan holds a Bachelor of Science in Computer Engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Nate, thank you for being here as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So as we get started here, I'm going to hand the reins off to the good folks at Gillware here, Chris and Nate, and we'll let them take it, and then I'm going to prompt questions here and there and kind of help lead the discussion on. But from here, Chris, Nate, the show is yours.
All right, so we'll clumsily hand things off back and forth as we go. Why are we here today? It's in the news. You see ransomware attacks constantly. A group of mayors of municipalities just got together and said, we're not going to pay the ransoms. That tune might change if they find they're going to be down for 6 months and can't collect taxes, but neither here nor there. But realistically, businesses are losing money now, and not just paying the ransoms. In the early days, 10 years ago, companies primarily used computers to communicate with each other and to store information. Now computers run everything, and as evidence of that, we see companies that get ransomware, they can't use any of their computers, and the business grinds to a halt, whether it's a bank or it's a manufacturing company or it's a clinic or whatever else. So it's a big deal if your computers are not available, and there are ways to protect yourselves. And the reason Nathan and I are both here, he runs the incident response side of things. I run the proactive information security side of things, helping businesses prevent needing to talk to Nathan. Not that it's not nice talking to Nathan, but you don't want to do it when the red light's spinning and there's people pacing behind your desk. But it makes my job a lot easier. And Nathan's experience on the ground has educated my risk management and information security practice in a significant way. And we hope that we can share that experience. Not to read slides to you, but this is what we're going to try to go through. Primarily, we're going to talk about the different types of incidents we have, at a high level methodologies that these attackers are using, and we'll try to keep it out of geek speak as much as possible. And we'll again at a high level, and there are some high level things you can do to prevent these kinds of attacks. And so with that, I'll have Nathan walk through what our incident process looks like.
Yeah, thanks, Christopher. So typically, an incident comes into us in a number of ways. A lot of times from a cyber insurance company, they'll set us up with a client that has some sort of incident, or legal counsel will sometimes bring the case to us, and we'll immediately jump on a call with the relevant people. The relevant people typically for the client are somebody on the IT side of things, and then a decision maker, and potentially in-house counsel as well. It's usually a relatively small team for that first call when we're trying to figure out the situation. So immediately after figuring out what the situation is, we have such a vast sample size of incidents that's really up to date by the minute of what we're seeing. So usually within the first couple minutes of the incident description to us, we know exactly what's going on. We know what we need to look in first to mitigate this issue. We know what the risk points are that maybe are also going on that's not immediately prevalent to the client. So the first thing is to, quote unquote, stop the bleeding, make sure that we mitigate risks as much as possible. So then, depending on what type of incident it is, and there's no shortage of cyber incidents that we look into. Right now, ransomware is the most popular type of incident that we look into for a couple of reasons. One reason is it's extremely profitable for ransomers, and they can immediately monetize an attack rather than stealing credit cards that then they have to sell for a couple of dollars a piece on the dark web, and it's a lot more of a long-term process for them. Ransomware, if a company has no choice but to pay the ransom, they typically make their money in about 24 hours. So that's why it's continuing to grow. The other reason is it's impossible for a victim to miss, because by design, their goal is for you to see that your data is inaccessible and see their ransom note and see how to contact them. So there's a lot of other cyber attacks that go unnoticed and dormant for years in organizations, and ransomware is not one of those. So that's one of the driving factors that brings so many of the cases to us. So for ransomware, obviously our goals are primarily to preserve evidence from the incident, get the attacker out of the system, and then get organizations back up and running, which could be helping restore backups, recover corrupted backups, any number of things. Or, we hope not, but sometimes the only option is to pay the ransom, to negotiate and pay the ransom. So after we kind of have gotten the person out of your system or the attackers out of the system, gotten up and running and preserved the evidence, then we have a longer running detailed investigation figuring out the exact timeline and actions of the incident to make sure that they didn't also steal data, or it's very common these days that we see them leave some sort of method to access your system again later on. And sometimes that's for a future attack. Sometimes it's to keep tabs on you as you're figuring out if to pay the ransom or not. They can kind of poke around and see what communications you're having with insurance companies or other people. So definitely something to keep in mind. But it's all about getting you back to where you were before the incident while keeping enough evidence to investigate it and make sure that you're safe and none of your data was compromised. So then once the investigation is finished, we typically are working with outside legal counsel that specializes in data privacy. And we will issue a full report with our findings to them that's then reviewed with you so that they can provide legal advice to you. That's the common flow of an incident, but it can take a lot of different paths. And every once in a while, depending on if it's an insider threat, some sort of employee misconduct, or something that goes to any sort of litigation, we do end up in court quite a bit providing expert testimony and working with legal counsel on that side of things.
I had a question for you guys, and my guess is you'll probably be getting to some of this coming up soon here, but it's on the top of my mind, so I'm guessing it might be on the top of some listeners' minds too. Can you talk a little bit about maybe why, we hear about the high-profile attacks that happen, whether it's to a municipality in Florida or Baltimore or Atlanta, or big data breaches. Capital One's the most recent blockbuster one that we're seeing. So I think a lot of times business owners feel that that's a problem for the other. That's not an immediate problem for me. Can you talk a little bit about, if we're looking specifically at sort of southern Wisconsin, south central Wisconsin, Dane County, how often are you seeing incidences happening to people kind of right here in our own backyard? I know you guys work nationally too, but how often do you see things happening to our neighbors right here?
Yeah, so very often, and I actually have a perfect example. It's not from the southern Wisconsin area, but it's a very similar company to lots of companies we have around here. It was actually immediately before this webinar. I was a couple minutes late because I was hanging up with them, and it was a pretty large landscaping company that did quite a bit of business, but they didn't have cyber insurance because they were like, well, we don't have data, we don't store credit cards, we're not at risk, no one cares about us, which is partially true from some of the data privacy aspects, but everybody has valuable data. And what happened to them is they fell victim to a ransomware attack, and their ransom was set at $35,000, I think, which was a pretty significant chunk of money for them. So they felt that they weren't a target, but they were an opportunistic target by the attackers. They don't really care about the size of your company or the data you have for the most part. The potential victims are people that they have the opportunity for. So we do cases from 2-person law firms to 20,000 employee companies, and they're all potentially very similar. The larger companies have more risks, but any type of company you can very easily become victim to a cyber attack that, quite frankly, we keep talking about ransomware, but it's just so prevalent. A ransomware attack without proper coverages and proper security in place can put a company out of business regardless of what industry they're in, where they're located, or how large they are.
And it can even bounce outside that organization. I just had a meeting last week with I'm going to be careful about not tipping things off, but they were in the Milwaukee area. They're a manufacturing and industrial company, and they had one of their raw material providers had suffered ransomware. All of their machines were completely locked down, and they weren't able to deliver the raw materials well, or sometimes double shipments would be coming. And so something was going on. We had a meeting with this manufacturing company because they said, how can we, are we doing the right things to keep it from happening to us, but how can we manage our third-party vendors that are suppliers to us, that if they're not available, we're in a lot of trouble. And so the impact sometimes splashes outside of the organization that has the ransomware attack.
Yeah. One thing that I'll say on that from the insurance perspective here, the first is that if you've got a decent cyber insurance policy, and there's lots of ways to define that, but one of the things you'll find on there is you will have coverage for dependent business interruption. So if you have one of your third-party vendors goes down with a ransomware attack and you are suffering a business interruption loss because of that, you can't insure for that sort of a risk. But the other thing that companies need to watch out for, if you have, there are certain cyber insurance carriers that are new to the market and trying to understand how to operate as an insurer in this space. And one of the things that they'll often do is they'll write a condition into the policy says that as a policy holder of this cyber insurance policy, you need to be verifying that all of your vendors also have done their due diligence and have good cybersecurity standards, which that's a struggle for even a very well-run organization that has a great information security program, which is not most companies at this point yet. Most companies are getting there, but that you're really, by saying that payments of this policy are conditioned on you making sure that all of your vendors are doing their due diligence, that's a really restrictive condition that I don't like seeing in policies, and frankly, I don't place policies with carriers that have that condition in them because I think it's that restrictive. So just one thing that if you do carry cyber insurance, one thing that you just want to double check to make sure you don't have that kind of condition within the form.
Yeah, third-party vendor due diligence is a real pain in the rear end for a lot of organizations.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so carrying on here, we'll have ransomware come up again. We've talked about it a ton, but it is by far the most common incident we see. One of the really interesting types of cases, it's been going on for years now, but we saw an extreme uptick that started right before the 4th of July this year, is organizations that distribute ransomware and other malwares targeting the vendors that you use, especially IT vendors, so your managed service provider, where they will compromise typically a remote access tool that your IT vendor uses, and then they will immediately encrypt all of the assets for every business and organization that IT company works for. So we had one where the IT company had nearly 1,000 clients, and overnight one night, all 1,000 of their clients were encrypted. And that can be a really difficult situation because there's the IT company that's trying to solve things, but you have kind of your standalone incident, and they can get pretty messy. But it's just something to think about because you trust your IT provider. Often they're providing security services for you, and that can be a risk as well.
Another case of a third party causing you trouble.
Mm-hmm.
We're also seeing, and again, been popular for a while now, but banking Trojans. And a Trojan is a very generalized term now for basically something that's hidden that allows a person with malicious intent to do something on your computer or your network. So banking Trojans, they've kind of evolved now to do other things, but originally they were designed to compromise passwords to your bank account so that they could go in and do wire transfer fraud. As banks put in better security in place so that you couldn't just log into anybody's account and do a wire transfer to a random account to start, then these Trojans evolved to them taking control of your computer and kind of stealing an already authenticated session to your bank. And now they've evolved again, and the banking Trojans, specifically TrickBot and Emotet, are two of the most popular ones. They can be used to deploy other malware. The malicious organizations have partnered together so that once they harvest your credentials for the banks, then they sell access to somebody that may want to deploy ransomware. And these are all things that are coming through emails, spam emails, sometimes very targeted. I think we may have a specific example, but one thing is social engineering training and malicious emails are very common, and people thankfully are starting to become aware that emails can't be trusted. But as the general population becomes more aware of attacks, the attacks advance. So one thing that this attack chain does is they will compromise somebody's email account. So for example, my email is nlittle@gillware.com. If somebody compromise my email account, they could use my email specifically to reply to an email chain from somebody else that they know was legitimately from me, and then add another attachment to that email chain. And it would be really easy to trust that because it's like, oh, this email chain where I was talking to Nathan about this outstanding invoice, he just sent an updated invoice. Of course it's legitimate. Let me open that. And that could contain malware. So there's just so many different ways that these attacks can happen, which is why they continue to happen. So these types of Trojans that steal passwords and data are very popular as well.
Nathan, you used the term social engineering in there. I'm guessing a lot of our participants probably know what that means, but I do run into folks that maybe aren't as familiar with that. Can you describe what the term social engineering means and how a business might run into that?
Yeah. So social engineering, I commonly call them the the digital con men. It doesn't have to be digital, but social engineering is just some way convincing somebody, typically from a not very technical fashion. It's not like an advanced piece of malware, but it's communicating via phone or email to trick somebody into doing something. You may be able to socially engineer them into giving up their password to some system that you're targeting. You may also be able to socially engineer them, so communicate with them and trick them into switching the bank account that a large transfer that you commonly make is about to go to. The example of that situation would be somebody jumping in the middle of an email chain after they've gained access to it and saying, you know, that $500,000 transfer that you're about to send to us for the construction equipment, just so you know, for 2020, we have a new bank. Please start to transfer it here. And they'll make those very believable. So it's just some sort of communication that leads to fraud or some other malicious activity.
So it's not necessarily, if you wanted to be one of these digital con men and do social engineering, you don't necessarily have to know how to do advanced computer coding or development or anything like that. You just have to kind of understand people and their motivations. And that's what you're the expert in, more so than how to write out lines of code.
It's old school con man stuff being applied to a new medium. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. And then because sometimes these social engineering attackers aren't technical, there's spots where they can go on kind of the dark web, the web that we don't typically see, where they can purchase these malicious attachments and they don't have to make them on their own. They can just say, I need a malicious email attachment designed to compromise somebody's email password. And then you can just buy that for a few dollars and you can tailor it however you want.
A few dollars, like $10 or $20 or like $400 or $500?
It depends on the quality. Some of the best ones that maybe you're the only person buying, so you know that email filters aren't going to pick it up as quickly, you may pay $5,000 to $10,000 for kind of a more custom piece. If it's something that tens of thousands of people have purchased, you may only pay $1.
That's a low barrier to entry.
Yes. So I mentioned this kind of in the social engineering aspect, but we've seen a lot of it, and the damages can be in the tens of millions of dollars. So much business is conducted through email, and so much malware is transferred through email, and social engineering goes through email. Somebody's email mailbox is a very valuable target to an attacker. And one thing they do that we see a lot of when they do that is they will set up specific forwarding rules and search terms that run regularly, looking for words like wire transfer, ACH, other banking terms. And when they see that, they'll get a little notification on their phone or anywhere else that says, hey, one of your compromised things has a wire transfer going on, jump in the middle of it. And what they'll do, they'll set up really creative mailbox rules, again, that aren't really technical. They're just basic IT things so that their victim stops seeing the emails in that chain, and then they're responding as their victim, and then they reroute the wire transfer. So that's the business email compromise leading to wire fraud transfer, and it can get very, very believable where they are creating a new phone number that's one digit off, and they're calling you when they know you won't be available, getting your voicemail, setting the voicemail recording on their new phone number to be the same as yours. So in your signature, they'll change the phone number, and when you call that to try and verify the wire transfer, it'll go to voicemail, and then they can respond and say, hey, sorry, I'm on another call. This is definitely legitimate. Saw your call. And it's hard to identify. You have to be very diligent.
Well, and to be clear, what happens, what Nathan's describing is someone's on your system for a long time, and we've seen people monitor, have compromised someone and just linger around in the environment for months, if not years, just waiting for the opportunity to come up.
And they may pass up some lower opportunities because they're working on a $6 million transfer. They may see you doing a couple of $15,000 transfers, but they're just waiting for it to be worth their time because they're so successful with other companies.
Sure.
So now we have kind of a very technical slide about ransomware, so I'm not going to go through each one as they pop up. I'm just going to get the whole image on the screen. So how ransomware typically is distributed, somebody will gain remote access to your organization, either through a Trojan, a piece of malware distributed any number of ways, or through sometimes remote access that you have in place legitimately for employees to work and do other things. They'll target those vectors, because once they gain access to that first section that's called remote desktop there in the middle of the screen, they'll kind of sit at that computer, which could be a customer support person, it could be anyone in the organization, and all they're doing there is deciding how they want to attack you, whether they want to do ransomware, whether they want to steal your data, whatever it may be, and they're just kind of watching what's going on. They're looking at how many other devices are on the network, they're looking up your organization to see the value of the organization, and then we see it anywhere from 30 minutes after first compromise to 8 months, a year after first compromise. One day, the first intruder, or they may sell access to somebody else, they decide, typically in the middle of the night, between 2 and 3 a.m. is the most common time we see, to spread through your network after they've carefully prepared and compromised admin credentials and other things, and they'll encrypt all of your systems. And meanwhile, while they've been on your network, they know that you probably have backups, so they're going to find where those are stored and make sure that they delete those, disable them, or do whatever it may be, so that your only choice is to pay the ransom. And they cause quite a bit of damage. We saw our first case not too long ago where they were actually able to get to kind of third-party cloud backups, which were totally off the organization's network. They just knew that they existed, so they sniffed around until they got the password to those backups. And what I mean by cloud backups are, they're typically kind of your last resort backups. You have all your local backups that your IT department can restore from very quickly, and then if the catastrophe hits, like major ransomware, earthquake, and takes out all your locations, you have some backups stored on typically your backup provider's server somewhere, totally separate from yours, that you can only access with a complex password and multi-factor authentication. And we saw our first case ever where those were compromised and deleted as well. And if you have any questions specifically about ransomware, I know we talk about it a lot, you hear about it a lot, but some people have different pieces that they may not fully understand. Feel free to chat them to us or reach out to us later, especially if they're specific to your organization. This little blurb on the bottom left is just about the most common variants we're seeing right now. Ryuk, R-Y-U-K, is very common. The reason why we mentioned that one is that by far has the highest ransom amounts. We've seen 7-figure ransoms for that. Typical ransoms are from $6,000 to $10 million. The average is probably in the $20,000 to $30,000, but some are just astronomically more expensive. Soden no Kibi is that middle one. That's the one that we're seeing right now deployed through the IT vendors. So it's a very prolific, successful, and from the attacker's perspective, variant of ransomware. And then the last two, Phobos and Dharma, those are kind of the two simplest that we're seeing a lot of right now. Their deployment method is if you use remote desktop, so a specific type of remote control from the outside world without proper security in place. They're kind of an opportunistic, kind of low-budget type of attack.
And so I'll jump in with some of the strategies we can use to avoid ransomware. Ultimately, you need to have an information security program. And there's not just a box of security you can plug into your network and be protected. But there are some high-level best practices you can do to reduce your risk. And we always talk about reducing your risk, we can't guarantee that it's not going to happen. I equate information security maturity to health, where I can, I can eat granola and run 3 miles a day and drink all the water I need to and not smoke. And these are all reducing the risks of me having a health problem. But if I'm crossing the street and I look right and there's a dump truck coming from the left, I'm going to have a problem. And so sometimes it's those things you're not thinking about or that you just take for granted that can cause you the trouble. And Nathan mentioned remote access. if you take anything away from this talk today, let it be that Windows Remote Access, Remote Desktop, it's called RDP, is actively being exploited right now. And even if you have a patch system, there are unannounced vulnerabilities in these protocols. So if you're going to use remote access, please use a VPN gateway. And a VPN gateway is a secure way to connect to a remote network and make it look like you're sitting on that network. We should not only use the VPN for remote gateway or for remote access, we should also authenticate the users in a robust way. I will also say that ironically, or just sadly, a group of VPN vendors, people who sell these VPN solutions, just announced that there's vulnerabilities in the VPN solutions too. So it's a constant race, and the lesson there is keep your systems, especially your important systems that are exposed to the public internet, keep them patched and updated in a very short amount of time. Restrict administrator on workstation. So when someone double-clicks something in their email and it starts kicking off ransomware, if they're not a local administrator on that workstation and they're not a local administrator in their network, the spread of that infection is limited. And the effect that they can even have on their local machine is limited. So there's a way to set up workstations so that you can still get your work done. You can still even install software if you need to, but you're not a local administrator on your workstation.
So in layman's terms, that means employees they don't need the key to every single door.
Right.
You know, the administrator is that janitor walking around with the big hoop of keys that can open up everything. Not every employee needs the full rig of keys. They just need the one or two keys to open up the door and then open up the drawer on their desk, and then that's it.
And a robust environment is somewhere with a good, high level of maturity in their information security program. It's going to be pretty transparent to the users because the people are going to be able to do what they need to do to get their job done. But the other side of that is, but no more. Yeah. So they have the access they need, but no more than they need. And then finally here, multi-factor authentication, and that's where you've got an app on your smartphone that generates a 6-digit code, or maybe you've got some kind of biometric thing like the Face ID on iPhones. This is a thing that's you provide a username and a password, but then you need this other thing, this multiple factor, and that makes it so that if someone compromises your username and password, like the users Nathan was talking about, where they lurked around and looked for usernames and passwords to log into the cloud provider. If multi-factor authentication was in place in that case, they wouldn't have been able to log in because you need all three of those forms of authentication to get through. Oh, there wasn't the last one. Also, multiple lockouts. So this just means that if I fail a login attempt X number of times, then the account gets locked and a little red light spins in the administrator's console, so they know someone's been trying to log in an unauthorized way. And what this protects against is something called brute force password guessing, where they just run a script that goes through 5 million passwords and tries every one of those against your user account. And enforcing multiple login lockouts protects against that brute force guessing of passwords.
Chris, if you had to say, I think for users that have this, that probably is one of the instances where an individual might bump into an IT security situation maybe more commonly, because if they type their password, their finger slips and they hit the wrong password 3 times in a row, they have to call IT to have them unlock their station. Is there an optimal number of attempts that you would recommend? You know, is 5 too few? Is 20 too many? What are your thoughts on that?
I think each organization is going to find their sweet spot.
Yeah.
I don't want it to be as low as 3, but I think anything more than 10 would be ridiculous.
Okay.
And if your fingers are that fat, you might have bigger issues. But there are ways to kind of rectify that by itself, or maybe the lockout is only for 30 minutes, so that even in a worst case scenario where it's 2 in the morning and your IT people aren't available to reset your password, then you just wait 30 minutes and you can try again. Or there are also ways to do self-service portals where you can unlock your own password. But then you still need to authenticate that person in some way, and usually it's a smartphone app or something like that.
And one of the interesting things about password compromises and multi-factor authentication and multiple failed attempt lockouts is a lot of people think, Chris mentioned brute force, and there's a lot of different components to that. Brute force originally started out where it was from A to ZZZZZ with all the numbers in between. They would go through every possible combination of passwords. These days, there's been so many huge password breaches from companies that have millions and millions of accounts that the attackers will just look up, for example, your email and say, okay, of all the breaches that have ever happened, how many passwords do I have for mlittle@gillware.com? And then their brute force may be the 10 passwords of mine that have ever been breached. Again, not from us, but from you name your service that you log into. And then they may only have to guess 3 passwords that they know I've used in the past and get in. So that's why, regardless of how strong your password is, if you reuse it anywhere, it's a huge risk. And regardless of if you never reuse a password, if you have super strong passwords, you've never had an issue in the past, you still need multi-factor authentication. And a lot of people, and sometimes I agree, I log in to so many different systems so many times a day that the multi-factor authentication does slow you down by design because it is such a significant protection to your account. So it's absolutely critical. You should these days never be able to log into a system without grabbing some sort of authentication fob or your phone to get into it. And the other thing to keep an eye out for, about a year ago, 2 years ago, multi-factor authentication was almost never exploited to get into accounts. These days, when somebody does a password phishing attempt, now they've adapted to try to phish, which is just trick you into entering things. That's what I mean by phish. To phish your multi-factor authentication code, and then behind the scenes, that exact same second that you enter that, they're entering it into the legitimate service. So you certainly can't trust everything just because you have multi-factor authentication, but it's something critical to enable.
And can I go back just for a sec?
Please.
Yeah, Nathan was talking about this the database, or the when someone gets breached, a big company, Capital One or something like that, and they pull down the usernames and passwords, those get posted in this dark web, which is just websites that are difficult to get to. And in those forums and on those websites, they'll just post the whole dump of those usernames and passwords. People have gotten together all of those dumps and stitched them together in single databases that you can just search. In the course of us doing assessments, I do those searches, and I have that one of those databases on my computer. I mean, it's tens of gigs, so it's huge, but hard drives are so big right now and so cheap that I'm walking around with a laptop in my bag right now with millions of usernames and passwords from all these breaches. And we use that as part of our investigation when we do an assessment. So I'm not the only one with this database. And so if you go to the Have I Been Pwned, it's a website, haveibeenpwnd.com. You can put in your username, and it'll tell you if that username or that email address is part of one of these compromises. So that's a step you could take. Yeah. But it just blows my mind.
Yeah.
All right. So this one we probably won't spend a ton of time on, but this is kind of a lot of people, a common way an incident will start is somebody will click an email attachment and they kind of think, well, that wasn't quite right, but nothing happened. I didn't see any pop-ups. My computer's still working fine. Maybe it's embarrassment or just you're busy and you have other stuff to do and you don't notify IT and you just kind of carry on and you think, well, if anything crazy happens, I'll be sure to notify IT right away. So with this slide is specific to Emotet, one of those banking Trojans I mentioned, but it can be anything, any type of malware. So a malicious email is sent that's extremely believable these days. People commonly see the various obvious ones where somebody pretends to be Christopher Gerd, but I can see the email address and it's nothing like his real email and identify it as fake right away. The concerning ones are the ones that come to you that even the most savvy person would believe. So you open that, it opens a Word document that's specially crafted to display typically an image to you on the screen that looks very professional and says, this document is encrypted for confidentiality. Sometimes they'll even say you buy a certain company if they're targeting somebody specifically. We need you to, on the pop-up, click OK to enable the decryption process. But what's actually happening is they're hiding it from you with the wording they're using, but that Word document is asking if it can run essentially a piece of software, and in this case, a malicious software. So do you want to run this Microsoft Word macro, they're commonly called. So some people may be familiar with Excel macros that are very popular in the business world, but that's what it's asking to do. And then that launches all sorts of built-in Windows tools, so they don't even have to put a piece of malware specifically that would be easily identified by anti-malware tools onto your system with this. So PowerShell is just a built-in, it's a management tool for IT and other people. It's on every Windows computer these days. So they run a specific PowerShell command that reaches out to some random computer or server, just some sort of computer system in the world, and downloads the malicious file. And then it can take all sorts of paths from there, and it has all sorts of kind of anchors into your systems and ways for you may run a malware scan and it's a deleted emotet and you think everything's fine, but there's a task scheduled 10 minutes later to bring it back. But one thing that this malware does that we're seeing a lot, and it started kind of in late 2018, is it will actually comb through and harvest all of the content from your email archive file on your computer, and usually just kind of the start of an email. And that's what I was talking about, where they'll use real email content that you've seen before because they've harvested it from somebody else to make their malicious emails more trustworthy. And they'll compromise passwords, they'll download other malware, but that's kind of how it all starts. So when you open things and you think, that was weird, but nothing really happened, you may be seeing exactly what they want you to see. If you may see there was an error opening to this document, please reach back out to the person who sent it and see if they can send you another copy or something. And you may think, that was weird, but they'll send another one. But behind the scenes, there's a lot of malicious activity going on. Then there's the login credentials that I was talking about, and then from there they can, depending on who's pulling the strings on the other end, they can kind of decide how they want to attack. And then the last blurb, that Ryuk ransomware that I mentioned can have ransoms into the tens of millions of dollars. That's actually deployed through Emotet and another piece of malware. So all it starts with is a simple, very believable Word document, and it can lead to a compromise of tens of millions.
And because you clicked OK when that Word document popped up that message, everything runs as you. And all the controls that you have on your system say, oh, well, he said OK. So this is probably okay, and then you're already buried.
Now I'll hand it over to Chris.
So how do we avoid this? One of the biggest things is awareness training and looking for signs of phishing attack, looking for signs of spoofed emails, and this is getting harder and harder and harder. There are some tools that your organizations probably have in place to block incoming emails, and some of these anti-spam tools, anti-bad email tools, block, depending on the day, between 60% and 96% I've seen of incoming email is fake and bad and potentially malicious. And so it's a monstrous amount of a huge percentage of the traffic on the internet right now is this malicious stuff. So it just underscores that if you plug any computer into the public internet, it's actively getting attacked all the time. So you have to patch and update your systems, because most of these attacks, most of these malwares, most of these ransomwares are exploiting something that there's a patch available for it.
And a patch is just an update.
Right, a patch is an update to the system. It used to be that if we got the systems patched with it, every quarter, we're in good shape. But we're saying to companies now, you need to patch things like real time. When the patch is available, you need to distribute it through your system, because the risk of there being a problem is so high that it outweighs the risk of that patch or update breaking something. Because sometimes you install a patch and all of a sudden your software doesn't work like you expect it to. They've also made it easier to back out those patches if there is that kind of problem. So we're just saying patch and update as quickly as you can, or auto update if possible. And then again, we're talking about authentication. So make sure you have good usernames, passwords, and then you're also using multi-factor authentication for at least high-risk things like remote access or important databases, but use it everywhere if that's possible.
All right, so, and we're getting a little bit shorter on time, and I know we want to leave some time for questions and make sure we get through everything. So wire transfer fraud, we kind of already talked about it pretty extensively because it came up in the social engineering, but it's everything I've already talked about, where the attackers are very creative. We've even seen cases where somebody will send a wire fraud email trying to get you to transfer money to the wrong place. And maybe it's internal too. And so then they'll go to Skype chat and they'll chat the person. They're like, hey, did you just ask me to switch the bank account? It seems a little odd. I want to make sure it's you. But a lot of those systems use the same passwords and are tied together. So we've seen attackers just respond and say, like, yep, like do it as soon as possible. And then you feel like you're separate, but everything, Chris mentioned it at the start, everything is so intertwined and running on computers that it's just so hard to tell what's separate and what's not vulnerable and what's involved. So we see this type of case all the time. And the easiest way to mitigate, there's obviously a lot of technical controls, but having a policy where it should be very hard to switch a bank account. It should be a long process with multiple levels of approvals before somebody's bank account is switched once they're in your vendor system. And also detections for in case a vendor system is compromised, not by you, but by somebody else who gains access to it, and they start changing whether it's direct deposit or wire transfer information, that should be detected also by some sort of system.
And it requires manual steps, not technical steps. A manual procedure to get someone on the phone with a known email address, not the email signature like Nathan talked about.
Or phone number. Email address could be compromised out there.
I meant phone number, yeah.
Some sort of way that you know and trust you can get a hold of that real person and you recognize their voice, and then maybe another person.
And here's where I'll just jump in for a brief moment, because from a risk management perspective, that is 100% the best thing to do. From an insurance perspective, I don't want that condition in my client's insurance policy. So I don't, because that is something that could potentially restrict coverage. Because if you fail to pick up the phone and confirm that wire transfer, an insurance company might deny coverage for that claim. So there's a little bit of tension there where we 100% want that to be your organization's written policy, but you don't want to see that requirement in your insurance policy because that's something that restricts coverage. So it's just a good thing to point out there.
So we talked about these manual steps. Enabling two-factor authentication for your financial systems so that you can limit who can, because sometimes they'll just go in and change the account number in your financial system if you've got a bad authentication mechanism. Whatever financial package ERP solution you're using that handles your financial transactions, that's the soft, chewy center of your company and should be well protected. Same sort of thing. We need to authenticate people in a good way. So just to summarize, we're talking about limiting the services that are available to the public internet to just those that are necessary for your business. If you need to do remote access, use a VPN. Don't use RDP, remote desktop protocol. Information security awareness training is vital because we've seen organizations with some of the most robust information security programs we've come across still be vulnerable and still suffer issues because someone double-clicked on something. So that awareness training is huge. And then again, we're talking about authentication and authorization. Username, password, multi-factor authentication, but also sometimes taking a manual step to make sure that the person I'm transacting with is the person who I really think they are. So that's at a high level, the summary.
Okay, very good. Well, we've got, no problem. We got time for some questions here, and we did have a couple come in while the session was going on. One of the questions comes from somebody who's in their leadership team of the organization. The question essentially is, what questions should executive teams be asking their IT service providers? If you're the general counsel of a company, you certainly want to know that you've got the good people on your side protecting you. But from somebody who's not in the IT world, how do they ask questions, and what questions should they be asking of their IT security team, whether that's a managed service provider or whether that's a consultant they bring in like Gillware? What are the right questions they should be asking to get a better sense of where their information security posture is at?
Well, if they're a business partner, they're a partner, and that's a relationship. And so that partner should be willing to kind of lift the hood up and show you how they're doing things, and not just in paper, but allow you to audit and ask questions, or maybe even just fill out a questionnaire of this is a list of best practices. Is this how you do it? If you don't have someone on your staff that speaks that language or has information security or risk management training, then please do pull in a third party. And in fact, we're working on a new offering. I don't know what we're going to call it yet, but this has come up enough that we're essentially going to have a just dip your toe in assessment, a quick assessment that we can perform at an organization to see if they're doing the things they ought to protect themselves from at least ransomware and wire transfer fraud. Those are the two biggest things. Yeah. And so it's going to be a quick assessment that we can go in, like we're talking about this manufacturing company with that one provider of raw materials that's vital to them. They could, in a contract, require that they go through this audit, this assessment, to see, what their security posture is, whether it's red light, green light. So it can get regimented and pretty formalized. But the kinds of things we're talking about here with ransomware, at a minimum, you should be asking your service providers if they have those protections.
And to give kind of two specific questions for internal IT and then one for outside IT, and really both apply to each of them that you can just write down and email them and ask today, would be if your users or yourself have remote access to your system, which these days most companies have some remote employees, asking how do we remotely access our system and what protections are in place to make sure that even if somebody compromises our password or compromises something else, to make sure nobody else can use that easily to get on our network. And their answer should be detailed. It should mention multi-factor authentication. It hopefully mentions VPN, but if it doesn't mean it's not perfect. There's other ways to do it. But you can even reach out to a company like Gillware and say, okay, here was the response. Anything we're missing that's obvious, and we can give you a quick reply, and you can protect yourself from some of the most common attacks. And then to your IT staff or your outside vendor, sometimes it's more critical for an outside vendor, saying, I see that you can remote into our computers and help us when we have issues. It's obviously necessary to fix issues. What protections are in place for your system to make sure that nobody can compromise that and use it maliciously? For example, some of the names of tools. So if you hear them, you'll know them. Kaseya is a remote access tool. Bombgar is a remote access tool. ConnectWise. There's a ton of them, and they're all being used to deploy ransomware right now at no fault of those companies, mostly at the fault of the companies using the tools. So asking what protections are in place for remote access tools in general to make sure nobody can compromise them is a great, easy question to protect yourself against some of the most common attacks we're seeing right now.
Okay, perfect. Another one that came in from a particularly astute listener, they're asking questions about the California privacy law. They heard something about that. You're not attorneys, but can you give a sense as to what that might mean for a company here in Wisconsin?
Well, the CCP, it's called the CCPA, and a privacy attorney that we've worked with who gave a seminar on specifically this, called it a dumpster fire. But that's a technical term. That is a technical term. But the intent was to protect the privacy of consumers. And it's the California Consumer Privacy Act. But it's similar to the one that people might have heard as well, and it's GDPR, and that's the EU personal privacy directive. Yeah. And ultimately what it's doing is it's trying to make it so that consumers have control over their names, addresses, phone numbers, social security numbers, driver's license numbers. I mean, all these ways to identify them, which can be used to open up credit cards or that kind of thing. So it's to protect not just their privacy, but also their personal security. What companies in Wisconsin need to know is that if they just have a user or a customer that's in California, then they're relevant, and they need to be thinking of this. So what's going to happen is more and more of these states and municipalities and jurisdictions are setting up these privacy rules. There's some in the insurance industry, there's some in the banking industry, there's some in states, Ohio, North Carolina, New York all have them. And what's happening now is what happened in the EU that caused GDPR, and there's this patchwork of requirements and restrictions and laws. And what you need is someone who understands those to help you figure out what the high water mark is, so that you can protect the customer data so that you don't get in trouble for exposing it. And ultimately what it comes down to is if you don't need the data, don't collect it. Yeah. That's the best protection. If you're not a marketing company, that you're not a Google or a whatever business analytics company, advertising company that uses this large-scale marketing databases, if you don't need that information, don't collect it. If you don't need an address and a phone number for somebody, don't collect it.
Yeah. And if you haven't, maybe don't keep it.
Right. Or if you do need to keep it, protect it.
Yeah. Okay. One last question that came in is related to passwords. Talk about passwords related to, should they be longer? Should they be, lots of symbols and capital letters? What's the more secure password, a long one or a complex one, or both?
Both. And I'll defer to Nathan if you want, but I use a tool called 1Password. There's also LastPass and a few others, and these are just password vaults. And so I need to authenticate to my password vault, and sometimes that can use two-factor authentication. Sometimes it's just one really good password. But it has all of my passwords in it, along with the website that uses that username and password. If someone pointed a gun at my kids and said, "Give me your banking password," I couldn't give it to them because I don't know it. It's a 64-digit password that's completely random characters that I click a button in that password vault and it logs me into my banking website. And it changes periodically. Most of those sites also use multi-factor authentication, but that's the answer to your question is don't even know your password and have it be a random string of characters so that it's not in a database somewhere. And change it periodically.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Well, that's all the questions we've got here. We're just up on time. So
good. Well, we want to thank everyone for attending our webinar today, and thank you to Nathan and Christopher for joining us from Gillware. As a reminder, the ransomware prevention and response guides are available in the handout feature of this webinar right now, and they will also be included in the follow-up email. Please also remember to fill out the short survey, as your feedback is very important to us. We hope you can join us for our next webinar on August 15th, Does Your Drug and Alcohol Policy Stack Up? You can sign up for our upcoming webinars on the Hausman Johnson website. And again, thanks for attending and have a great rest of your day.